This is Anything for You. Sweet Haven Farm, Sweet Small Town Romance, Book 4. Written by Jessie Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 1. Chapter 1. The words elephant and wedding really didn't belong in the same sentence, even if the wedding in question was being held in a barn. At least, that was Jillian Powell's experience. But what did she know? She spent most of her life in the Mexican circus, where the word elephant and pretty much any other word in English or Spanish would have been perfectly normal. Possibly mundane, even. At her current location, in central Pennsylvania at the wedding of her good friend and dubious relation Avery Williams, though, elephant definitely did not fit.
"What did you say that noise was again?"
Avery leaned over and whispered in Jillian's ear. The brass ensemble that had been playing in the background while the guests had started eating had taken a break. The low murmurs of the guests had jerked into stunned silence when Heidi, the elephant, had trumpeted just a few seconds ago. Jillian's palms started to sweat and her heart shivered like leaves that had been blown from a baobab tree by the lonely and sad trumpet of an African bush elephant.
"It's Heidi,"
Jillian whispered back, surprised her voice only shook a little. Heidi and her sister, Hazel, had been part of Jillian's act when she'd been in the Mexican circus. Not that she was going to go into her history with the elephant that currently stood below them in the long-unused barnyard. That wasn't exactly the most pressing question on anyone's mind anyway. How did the elephant get here might be the top question in most people's minds. Jillian, however, was more concerned about the best man. No, she wasn't attracted to McKoy Rodning, although with his square jaw, strong nose, and broad shoulders, he probably was attractive. Maybe she did spend more than the average amount of time thinking about him, only because of her recently opened dog kennel, or maybe because of her general distrust of government employees. But her current level of apprehension stemmed from the fact that McKoy Rodning was the animal control officer, and it was pretty much his job to question why an elephant would be trumpeting, independent of the brass band, at Avery and Gator's wedding. And there she had it. Elephant and wedding in the same sentence, once more, sounded no more harmonious than they had the first time.
"And you know Heidi?"
Avery whispered, the pucker between her brows not matching the bright smile she flashed the curious guests who had slowly started conversing in low tones, throwing occasional concerned glances up at the wedding party table.
"Yes."
Jillian rubbed her wet palms together, trying to remember she was wearing satin and not denim, and could not wipe her hands down her legs like she longed to do. Hopefully, the sweat that gathered in her armpits wasn't noticeable as long as she kept her arms pressed firmly against her sides. The musicians began filing back to their seats. Avery pushed her half-eaten piece of cake away from the edge of the table and gave Jillian a nervous smile.
"If you leave before this dance, it will be noticeable. But I think once it ends, you could slip out and take care of whatever you need to. Maybe I can get Gator to distract McCoy. You two just enjoy each other. I can handle it."
It's not like she hadn't learned plenty of survival skills growing up in the circus. Although how one would take care of an elephant problem in central Pennsylvania presented a quagmire she wasn't sure her skill set could handle. Avery squeezed her hand, her shiny pink nails sparkling in the romantic barn light.
Thank you for spending this day with me."
Jillian's smile was genuine as she squeezed back. Avery had been a great friend to her. "Guess this is where I try not to step on your toes," Gator spoke, and Avery's head swiveled to him. He had stood and held his hand out to her, his eyes full of love and admiration, even if his request to dance had been less than romantic. His jeans and plaid shirt looked new, though they weren't typical groom attire. They suited the barn wedding, and they suited Gator even more, just as the lacy white dress suited Avery. Unfortunately, the coral satin dress Jillian wore might look fabulous next to her brown skin and black eyes and hair, but she would feel slightly more comfortable in a bikini standing at the South Pole than she currently did in the dress and the 4-inch heels. She wore outfits like this when she performed in the circus. Well, maybe not with the full skirt that fell below her knees, but definitely with heels this high. She could hold a hoop for the dog act, hang by her hair above the audience, twist herself into a pretzel, perch a monkey on her shoulder, and ride the lead elephant's trunk around the show ring with no more nervousness than if she were sitting in bed, reading a book. But somehow she felt she needed the security of comfortable jeans, worn sneakers, and a soft t-shirt to face Mr. McKoy Rodning, animal control officer and the only one currently in attendance at this wedding who had the power to remove Heidi before Jillian could figure out where she came from, who brought her, and what she was going to do with her. If he knew the secret that her hosts, the Finkenbinders, didn't know, Avery didn't even know, he could have her sent back to Mexico. But she didn't have the security of comfortable clothes, and he stood beside her, one hand behind his back, one hand held out to her, bowing slightly. The manners in his posture were impeccable, but the look in those powerful blue eyes was speculating. Their relationship was not exactly harmonious. They didn't belong in the same dance together any more than elephant and wedding belonged in the same sentence. With a lift of her chin and a glint of her own eye, she met the challenge of his gaze, placing her hand in his, like sticking her fingers in a light socket. Jillian fought to hold steady as shock waves ricocheted up her arm, past her elbow, and slammed into her shoulder. Her eyes flew to his, even as her automatic brain took over, and her performing smile slid easily into place on her face. The net might have broken, but she would smile all the way to the ground. Her fingers, long and slender like the rest of her body, rested lightly in his large, calloused hand. The touch was light, but that crazy electricity that zapped between them felt stronger than the poles that held the big top up. Her performance mask solidified on her face. "Thank you," she said as she rose gracefully. Something flickered in his eye as she straightened to her full height, her eyes square with his chin. Her stomach jumped in answer. Nervousness. It had to be. Had he recognized that noise for what it was? He led her to the dance area, where Avery and Gator already danced to the dulcet tones of the brass ensemble. She'd have to distract him so he wouldn't ask about the noise. But how? All she knew about McCoy she'd heard from the town gossips. He was the dog catcher, straight-laced, followed the law to the T. Solid, dependable, still lived in the house he grew up in. Boring. She could try to talk about stocks and bonds. That sounded boring enough to suit his personality, except she couldn't hold even a remotely intelligent conversation about that. Maybe he was the kind of man who dominated conversations and tried to show by his verbosity how erudite he was. It was too much to chance. He stopped and she turned, her skirt billowing out, brushing his leg. Something about the soft satin of her skirt brushing the rough denim of his pant leg mesmerized her, and she watched as the material seemed to flow, smooth as cream over strawberries, across his strong leg. She'd been required to do a lot of things in her time as a performer, but talking wasn't one of them. Her brain seemed to freeze as his large hand came up to settle with a whisper on her waist. His lips didn't turn up, and he looked as serious as a pallbearer at a funeral. Apparently, he wasn't any more eager to dance with her than she was with him. She'd just opened a dog kenneling business here on the farm, and so far he'd left her alone, but that didn't mean he wouldn't be visiting. All of her paperwork was in order. Her business paperwork. Fink, who owned the farm with his wife Ellie, had filed it for her. Her personal paperwork, on the other hand, was non-existent. From what she'd heard of McCoy, he wouldn't hesitate to turn her in, but he shouldn't have any idea that she wasn't legal, unless she managed to stuff her high heel in her mouth in the next 3 minutes. Because of the different nationalities in the circus, she'd grown up speaking 4 different languages: Slovak, Romanian, Spanish, and English. Her Slovak and Romanian were rusty, but she was fluent in the other 2 languages. She'd been told her accent was faint. Would he notice? All of her upbringing had been focused on giving the audience a performance that made them feel their money was well spent. It was time to put her talent to use. He tilted his head as though listening, then opened his mouth. He was going to ask about that noise. She was sure of it. She had to speak first. She had to distract him. Did you know that all monarch butterflies winter in one general area in Mexico? His mouth froze halfway open. His brows slowly formed a V, and if she'd read the look in his eyes correctly, he had just decided she was eccentric, if not slightly nuts. Perfect. He wasn't thinking about elephants anymore. It's beautiful to visit in the winter and see them almost covering every tree or bush within that certain square mile or 2. He blinked. The circus had been playing a week-long show near the mountain on which the butterflies spent the winter, and she'd gone with her mother and several others to see it. There's a lot of deforestation going on near that area, and scientists are afraid the monarchs will lose their home. Surely Mexico has laws in place to prevent that from happening, McCoy said with typical American naivete. Americans thought Mexico was like America. In Mexico, the person with the biggest bribe wins. She remembered just in time she wasn't supposed to sound bitter. Sounds like a nice vacation, he said, ignoring the uncomfortable idea that monarchs might become extinct. Not surprising. They swayed gently to the music. McCoy wasn't trying any fancy dance moves, which fitted exactly what she'd heard about his personality. He seemed uncomfortable in front of the guests, too. She'd exhausted her monarch trivia, and he had that look in his eye, like he might be asking about the noise that had sounded suspiciously like an elephant trumpeting. McCoy might not be her favorite person, but normally she wouldn't purposely do something that made someone uncomfortable. For Heidi, she felt like she had no choice. Did I tell you I used to be a dancer? It was a rhetorical question, since they'd never spoken before 5 minutes ago. He shook his head, his mouth still slightly open. She gave him a little smile that might have had just a hint of deviltry in it. I'm going to spin. Hang on. A look very close to panic flashed across his face before she moved, grabbing his hand and stretching out their arms, then spinning herself up next to him. Their faces were only inches apart before she spun out, bending backward. She wasn't quite as flexible as she used to be, and her head was less than a foot off the ground, rather than the mere inches it would have been in her circus days. The guests clapped. She straightened slowly and twirled under his arm, turning completely around several times. Her skirt billowed out, but she refused to acknowledge it brushing his jeans. It wasn't herself she was trying to distract. This time, as she twirled into him, he caught her, probably on accident, with his arm around her waist. Her unconventional childhood had also taught her never to waste an opportunity. She bent over his arm, careful not to lift her leg up too high. She hadn't been expecting this, and her undergarments were not sufficient for that kind of show. The song faded out on a low chord. She bent backward one last time, seeing Avery and Gator smiling before they kissed. The guests clapped. She straightened. McCoy offered his arm, which surprised her for some reason. His cheeks were red under his tan, and he didn't look her in the eye as she took it, and he led her back to her seat. She'd been trained since birth to be in complete control of her body at all times. So McCoy would never guess when she tripped and spilled the punch sitting on her table down the front of her dress that it wasn't an accident. "Oh, no," Jillian said with a glance at Avery and Gator, who were oblivious, wrapped up in each other's arms. "I'd better go blot this so the stain doesn't set." She'd had plenty of experience in the circus of sewing costumes and getting stains out, and it didn't matter how much blotting she did, that stain was never coming out of her dress. But she was willing to sacrifice her pretty bridesmaid dress on the altar of saving Heidi. McCoy jerked his head up and stepped back so she could go around him. The restrooms in the renovated barn were around the corner at the far end in what used to be the granaries. There were no windows in the small single-user bathrooms, but there was a window at the end of the hall between them. Jillian opened it, hitched her dress up, and climbed out. Chapter 2. McCoy pulled his shirt sleeves down and adjusted the cuffs at the end of his wrists. It wasn't a task that required his eyes, and they stayed hooked on Jillian as she walked away. Floated away was more like it. He'd never met a more graceful woman. Funny how that glass of punch seemed to jump up onto her dress. He grabbed several napkins off the table and blotted up the few drops that had made it to the ground, trying to get his breathing under control while waiting for his brain to wake up from whatever spell the woman had put it under. He'd never been so bewitched by a lady in all his life. Monarch butterflies, backbends as graceful as a ballerina, and he, a clumsy clod whose sole purpose throughout the dance was trying to breathe and avoid stepping on her toes. He kept his face toward the restrooms, watching for Jillian to come back out. The few times he'd seen her, her black eyes had always regarded him suspiciously, but today it seemed like she was hiding something. Then she deliberately tried to dazzle him with her supple grace and amazing dance moves. It had worked, to a point. He was just like any other man when a beautiful woman draped herself over his arm. At least, he figured he was. Not that beautiful women were rushing to drape themselves over his arms. But in theory. Funny, because Jillian had gone out of her way to avoid him every other time they'd gotten within 20 feet of each other. So, yeah, he was pretty sure she hadn't all of a sudden developed a thing for him. Maybe she just liked to dance. Couldn't be fun dancing with someone like him, who had 2 left feet that didn't know how to do much more than shuffle around the floor. She had enough talent for both of them. Two teen girls whose family owned and bred Roddies on the other side of Love, the nearest town to Sweet Haven Farm, giggled as they went down the hall to the restroom. There was only one room for ladies, so Jillian would be hurrying back soon. He'd keep his eye on her when she did. The woman was hiding something. His job had taught him to recognize all the tells.
"There's that big, strong dog catcher,"
Mrs. Paulson exclaimed as she hobbled over, her walker clacking in front of her. He hated it when people called him the dog catcher. He did a lot more than round up strays. But he couldn't get upset with Mrs. Paulson. She'd paid him to mow her grass when he was younger, his first job. Plus, she was a friend of his mother's.
"I want to dance with you,"
Mrs. Paulson clinked to a stop in front of him. "Let me help you, Mrs. Paulson." He offered his hand as she settled her walker off to the side. Telling her no wasn't an option, but he could keep his face pointed at the restrooms. The band started up, a brisk, upbeat song. Mrs. Paulson was 80 if she was a day, and McCoy couldn't dance worth squat, so he could see this ending badly. But he gamely stood while Mrs. Paulson put her arms around his waist. He put his hands on her shoulders. The faint scent of eucalyptus oil mixed with spaghetti sauce drifted up to his nose. Her white hair swayed in the breeze as she leaned on him and did an old lady-type hop.
"My Billy knew how to tear up the dance floor,"
Mrs. Paulson shouted over the music. McCoy nodded. He wasn't much of a shouter. Couldn't dance, didn't shout. Maybe Isabella, his ex-fiancée, had been right when she'd called him boring. That had been a little over 10 years ago, before they were out of college. She'd spent their junior year in Germany. She'd taken his engagement ring with her, but she'd left it in a pawn shop in Paris after meeting a big, blonde German dude who looked a lot like McCoy, although their bank accounts didn't have anything in common. McCoy had figured it boiled down to money and didn't pay much attention to the boring comment. Not true. For the last 10 years, he'd pretty much given up on impressing a girl, since his idea of a good time was sitting on his front porch with his uncle who'd raised him and watching the sun go down. A really exciting evening might having them doing that while eating ice cream. Jillian would consider him boring. He wasn't sure where that rogue thought came from, but he squashed it. He didn't give a fig what Jillian thought. Just then, the two teens who had gone to the restroom came back out the hall, their heads still bent together, laughing. McCoy's eyes scanned the dance floor. Jillian was not among the guests. Mrs. Paulson did an extra high hop and landed on his cowboy boot. His lip twitched, but he managed not to flinch while he tightened his grip on her shoulders until she caught her balance. Thankfully, her orthopedic shoes were flat-soled.
"Oh, Sonny, I'm sorry."
She squeezed his waist.
"It's so nice to have a strong man to hold on to."
He wasn't real interested in holding on to any man, strong or otherwise. "I'll take your word for it."
"Huh?"
Her head swiveled up and she squinted at him.
"What did you say?"
"Okay." He didn't yell, but he did try to give an extra punch to his words. Where was Jillian? And what was she hiding? She'd opened a dog kennel in the past few months. Because of his job, how he traveled all over, he knew most of the gossip in town. Word of mouth said the place was clean and well run. McCoy wouldn't expect anything less of a business under Fink's direction. But it was his job to do an inspection, and he'd be getting around to it soon. The song ended, mercifully. They hadn't moved too far from their little corner of the dance floor, and McCoy helped Mrs. Paulson shuffle back to her walker.
I'm not as flashy as your previous partner, but it was nice of you to give an old lady a few minutes and a nice dance.
McCoy nodded, and Mrs. Paulson shuffled off. A hand clamped on his shoulder. "Thanks for standing up with me," Gator said. "It was my honor." McCoy turned and shook the proffered hand. "Happy to do it." "Yeah, I know you probably had 100 other things you could have done today, but I appreciate it." "Wish you the best, man," McCoy said. "We're cutting out. Just wanted to let you know." McCoy grinned. "Better get. You don't want to miss a second of that wedding night." Gator flashed a grin of his own, even as his eyes sought out his bride, standing over by his mother. "I don't think she's going to leave without me." "Where are you going?" McCoy asked. They'd spent some time together before the wedding, but they'd not talked about honeymoons. "Montana. We're spending the week there. My mom's done with her treatments, and the doctors say no cancer, so now is the time to go." "I can check on your mom if you'd like." "That would ease my mind some. Jillian will be stopping in, too. She and Avery usually take food over when I have to be gone." He wasn't excited about running into Jillian. But speaking of, do you know where Jillian went? Gator's gaze skidded away. "That was some dance you two had." "I didn't figure you took your eyes off Avery long enough to have any idea of what the rest of the world was doing." Gator laughed and slapped McCoy on the back. "I'll see you in a few weeks or so. Avery has a wedding to coordinate here next week, so we'll be around." "Have a great time," McCoy called after him. With one more glance around the rustically decorated barn, McCoy moved over along the wall and walked to the restroom. He turned the corner of the hall. The bathroom door hung open, empty. It was a dead end, but the window was cracked. McCoy strode quickly down the hall and to the window. Too high. No way someone could go out and survive that fall. He pushed the window down and locked it before turning and peering into both bathrooms. Dark and empty. He could have missed Jillian, maybe when Mrs. Paulson stepped on his toe. But his gut was telling him he wasn't wrong, that Jillian was up to something, and she wasn't on the barn floor with the rest of the guests. Moving back out of the hall, he looked around as he came to the big open room. Lights that looked like lanterns hung from the ceiling, along with greenery and some kind of white flower. It was a tall ladder that would have gotten up to those rafters where the lights were strung. The brass instruments were playing a popular tune and the guests were laughing and clapping. Gator and Avery were gone. Jillian still wasn't there. McCoy slipped behind the chairs and tables and out the side door into the chill of late winter. Spring was a few weeks away. The patches of snow, like islands in a brown sea, were getting smaller and smaller. He hardly paid attention to the melting snow as he strode around the side of the barn. It was late afternoon, and the sun had almost nestled on top of the mountain. He was snooping, no other word for it, but his gut was never wrong. Faint barks came from on down the hill where a low building, surrounded by chain-link fence, sat beside a large field of Christmas trees. He could see a couple of the large dogs running out of their dog doors, barking and running back in. None of the animals were tethered, and they all looked healthy. He was sure that everything was code, but he'd be around to check. Rounding the corner of the barn, he went down a steep hill and came to a long metal gate. He paused and listened. He thought he could hear a voice, soft and low. The memory of Jillian's voice, sweet and lyrical, with a hint of some accent he couldn't trace, brought an unexpected longing to his soul. He shook his head. Her crazy talk about butterflies, of all things. She gave new meaning to the definition of small talk. Weren't they supposed to talk about the weather? At least she hadn't talked about the latest TV shows. He wouldn't have been able to say as much as he had. Unlatching the chain that held the gate shut, he opened it and slipped inside, closing and latching it behind him, cognizant of the number one rule of farm living: close the gate. The barnyard was muddy, and he stepped carefully, trying to keep his good boots from getting ruined. The talking came a little clearer and louder. Suddenly, an ear-killing noise rent the air around him. He wasn't expecting it, and he actually started to duck, although he'd never been in a war zone. He'd also never heard an elephant trumpet in real time, but he'd watched enough documentaries that he was pretty sure that's what it was. Except he was under a barn in central Pennsylvania, and elephants weren't native to any state in the Union. Pythons had invaded the Everglades. The climate wasn't right for elephants. It came again. This time McCoy didn't duck, but the sound made his ears ring.
"Would you please stop? You're scaring her."
He peered into the deeper gloom of the area under the barn, where her voice, soft and husky, with just a trace of a faint accent he couldn't place, came from. His eyes needed a minute to adjust. Eventually, he distinguished Jillian's face out of the gloom, and that bright coral dress, the one that made her complexion glow, that contrasted with her black hair and snapping black eyes, making them shine. Nothing was shining in the gloom, but Jillian's irritation almost crackled. Eventually, he could see eyes, way up toward the ceiling, and one tusk. Holy smokes! It was much bigger than he might have expected an elephant to be. That really is an elephant. Jillian put her hand on the beast's trunk, between her eyes, and spoke low and soft. A shaft of fear split through McCoy's backbone. "You better get back. I've heard they can be unpredictable, and of course, they're strong."
"I have experience with elephants."
"Oh?" His shock faded and questions, legal questions, started whirling through his mind.
"I worked in a circus for a lot of years."
Ah, maybe she picked up her accent from fellow performers who were from a different country. He nodded at the beast. "Is this your elephant?" His eyes had gotten more accustomed to the gloom, and he could see her hesitation. The way her hand stopped rubbing the elephant's nose, the way she bit her lip. She shifted.
"Yes."
Something off there. "You have a permit?" He'd have to brush up on the actual law since, although he was the animal control officer for this area, he'd never dealt specifically with a privately housed elephant before.
"No,"
she said.
"Do I need a permit?"
"Yes, of course you do." He tried to sound like he knew what he was talking about, since it was his job after all, although he was completely faking it, since he didn't really have a clue. Still, while there were differences between the types of animals and specific regulations, most exotic animals required a permit and certain space and water specifications.
"I'll get one,"
she murmured. "How long have you had it? Funny that Gator hadn't mentioned it."
"It just got dropped off today."
She dropped her hand from the elephant's face and stepped toward him. He felt like she was trying to get him to back up. He crossed his arms over his chest. Technically, he was off duty, but this was definitely something he needed to check out. If he wanted that promotion that was coming up, he'd better not let a little thing like an unpermitted elephant exist right under his nose. If his coworker, Todd, found out about it, he'd be telling their boss, and the promotion almost certainly would go to Todd. The promotion meant more money, sure, but it also meant less travel and no overnight work trips. He'd be able to keep his uncle in his house rather than having him move to a senior living center. I can give you 30 days, but you'll need to have a permit by then.
I will.
Her voice was confident, lilting, and stirred the pleasure sensors in his ears. Interesting, since he hadn't even known that he had pleasure centers in his ears until he'd heard Jillian speak. She took another step forward. She still wore the heels she'd danced in. Her dress shimmered around her legs. All of it looked out of place in the dingy barnyard. "Do you know what they eat?" he asked, his voice sounding gruff.
Yes.
Can you afford to feed it? That's where people seem to get into trouble. Everyone thought it would be cool to own a boa or tiger or some other exotic animal, but they didn't figure in the expense of providing food for such a creature. It didn't even have to be an exotic animal. He'd seen plenty of horses whose owners hadn't considered how much they needed to eat. Another lip bite and eye shift.
Yes.
From her reaction, he believed she really did know what they ate and knew it was going to be expensive. What do they eat?
They eat grass. I could feed her hay, straw even. I can get shavings from the mill.
She seemed to be talking in future tense, which he found odd. So you have some food for her tonight?
I promise she'll be taken care of. Why don't you go back and enjoy the reception, and I'll deal with Heidi.
He stood with his hands on his hips. She'd just basically ordered him out. He really didn't have a leg to stand on unless he was here in an official capacity. He didn't want to make an enemy, but the elephant had to be his first concern. "Can I help you?" he asked. Yeah, she wasn't expecting that. Her brows shot way up and her red lips parted. He snapped his eyes away from her lips.
She's upset and scared. I think it's best if I do it.
How'd she get here?
I don't know.
He tilted his head. You don't know? She sighed and looked away.
I know that sounds weird, but it's true. I wasn't expecting her. I don't know how she got here, and I don't know who brought her or why. But I'm sure this is Heidi, one of 2 sister elephants that I worked with in the circus.
The tip of a gray trunk fell around Jillian's neck, coming out from under her hair that lay in limp curls on her shoulders. McCoy's breath caught in his lungs. Hold still. I'll distract it while you move away.
What?
Her hand reached up and she took the trunk in her hand, stroking it with her other.
She's scared and doesn't want me to leave her. She and her sister, Hazel, never left each other's sides. It's very weird to me that she's here alone.
Her teeth bit down on her lip again.
I'm actually worried about Hazel.
I might be able to put a few feelers out, but Heidi is the one that's here, and she's the one we need to feed yet, tonight. His eyes had been telling him for the last few minutes that the light was fading. The brass ensemble still played above them, and probably would be for another hour before McCoy had to go and help clean up.
I can do it,
Jillian insisted. She'd caught his subtle use of we and made sure to correct him. So she was scared of his official capacity. Lots of people were. like seeing a cop sitting along the road made everyone hit the brakes whether they were speeding or not. I'm not out to get you. As long as you get a permit in 30 days and submit to one scheduled inspection and one unscheduled inspection per week, things will be just fine. He did have some experience with that protocol, the one where they made the inspections. He'd done it twice. Once with a guy who had a snake with no permit, and once with a guy who had a wolf. Which reminded him, where are the papers for her?
What papers?
Her eyes got big. However they brought her, she should have come with papers.
I'm sorry. I just found her maybe 10 minutes before the wedding started. I haven't had time to look for papers. Maybe they're at the house.
He shoved a hand in his jeans pocket and hooked the other one around his neck. I'll tell you what. I'll wait to examine the papers until the first inspection. Now, how about we get her a drink and something to eat, and we'll get her settled for the night? Her nose wrinkled and her cheeks tucked in like she was biting the insides of them. He pulled out a pack of gum and held a piece out. Here, give your lips and cheeks a break and chew on this. Her brows lifted, and her eyes shifted from the gum to his face before she gave a little, very little, laugh.
Okay, thanks.
Now, will Fink and Ellie mind if you use some of that baled hay over there? He pointed to a stack of hay in the corner. It looked as old as time, but hay, once baled, didn't go bad as long as it didn't get wet.
Yes, I'm sure I can use whatever is here.
Okay, then. Are you keeping her back there? I'll carry a few bales back.
This is where I found her, so I think we should feed her here. I'll have to do something else about water.
He made 2 trips, carrying a bale in each hand both times by pulling the strings together, a trick he'd learned from summers spent helping neighbors bale hay. Then he dragged a metal trough back as far as he could before going to look for hoses and water. There were animals kept down here before, a long time ago, apparently, but it was a given there was water somewhere. He found the spigot. An old, ratty-looking hose lay curled up beside it. He wasn't surprised when the hose leaked after he twisted it in and turned the spigot on. But enough water came out of the hose to start filling the tank, which, thankfully, didn't leak. While he was working, he kept an eye on Jillian. She moved in graceful, easy movements around the elephant, confident and unafraid. It wasn't hard to believe her that she'd worked with elephants before. As long as she got the permit, everything should be fine. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great Jessie Gussman audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.